My name's Sian Gannon. I'm the clinical nurse specialist at the Rare Care Centre, and I am your host today for the Global Nursing Network for Rare Disease Education webinar. We are very lucky to have our speaker today with us, Rachel. But before we get on to the session, I will just like to do our introduction. So just to let you know that the recording will be placed on the Global Nursing Network's Rare Disease YouTube, where you will be able to access the session after today. For those that are international as well, hello, welcome. We are very grateful for you to be watching via our channel. With that said, as a global network, we will respectfully acknowledge the Native, Indigenous and First Nations people on whose ancestral lands we gather around the world, as well as the diverse and vibrant cultures that they represent. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. As I'm sure you're all aware, if you can keep your microphones on mute during the session, unless asked to discuss and interact, that would be great, which is absolutely encouraged and welcomed. Please feel free to keep your camera on or not, it's completely up to you. And please feel free to utilize the chat function if you do not have access to a microphone. And we welcome all questions and discussion, both verbally and in the chat, but we obviously will like to respect everyone within the meeting itself. So for those of you that are watching on our YouTube channel and you aren't a part of the Global Nursing Network, you can still join to gain these webinars for free and live. You can use the QR code here to sign up and register today. Or you can just go to our website, the gnnrd.org, to sign up today and to connect with like-minded nurses around the world who have an interest and passion in rare disease. So on that note, I will hand over to the wonderful Rachel to introduce herself and start her presentation. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sian. It is lovely to be with you all, those here live and present and those watching online in your own time. My name is Rachel Callander, and while I am not actually a healthcare professional, this presentation and work that I share with you comes from the space of being a mother. So I have my own personal lived experience in the rare disease space, but it also comes from my perspective as an artist. And so I'm bringing all of these perspectives together. I now work as a healthcare communication consultant. So I teach healthcare professionals across the globe strategies to form positive, empowering and effective relationships together, because I believe healthcare should be a partnership, and nurses are often a critical part of that partnership. Nurses do a lot of compassionate work and are required to often pick up a lot of that compassionate slack that's potentially left behind in the wake of unintentional miscommunications, shall we put it. So that's the heart of my work, and I'm delighted to be here. I am going to share a presentation with you and some slides, and I've just told Sian that I have these bundled up nicely in a beautiful resource pack for you, so that will be accessible on the YouTube channel and links as well for you to access later and share with your colleagues. And it goes into a bit more examples and a bit of a deep dive into what we share today, because we only have a short amount of time together. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we will go from there. Here we go. So this is me, Rachel Callander. I'd love to stay connected with you if you would like to. I always wanted to be a photographer when I was young, and as soon as I finished high school, I went to art school to study fine arts. I'm originally from New Zealand, and so I studied at the School of Art in Otago, which is in Dunedin, and loved everything about my time at art school. It was interesting because every piece of work I made, no matter what medium I was working with, it always seemed to have the same kind of theme. I was really fascinated by creating works of art that explored the idea of finding beauty in brokenness, where I found myself finding little treasures in the overlooked or discarded parts of the world. So in these photographs, I've found a little treasure in a feather on a muddy puddle, or an intricate landscape in a dying blossom. And I loved finding these discoveries, and and finding these intricate parts that make up the whole, like the small unseen pieces. And while I was at art school, a lot of my friends and family would ask me, Rachel, are you going to be a wedding photographer when you graduate? And I was just like, no, actually, I'm going to be a real artist. Thank you very much. I thought that wedding photography was way too far beneath me, and I was going to go off and have exhibitions and be famous or something. And then while I was still studying, my cousin asked me to photograph his wedding. And so I did. And this is in the days of film. So it's quite a number of years ago. And I found, to my horror, actually, that on this particular day when I was photographing his wedding, I was having the time of my life. I loved it. I just thought this is the greatest job in the world. And so after I graduated, I set up my own wedding and portrait photography business. And I named it Callander Girl Photography, which I thought was quite clever of me, given my last name. And unbeknownst to me, just a few months after I had started my little business, another business moved in just around the corner, offering very different services to what I was providing. And so I became the recipient of some very strange late night phone calls wanting me to provide very unusual services. But nevertheless, I loved my life as a wedding and portrait photographer. And I was thrilled to be asked to capture the beauty and the madness and the chaos and the love and the connection and the history and all the details and just the celebration of this time in a couple and a family's life. I felt a bit like a rock star, actually. I was flown all over New Zealand and sometimes overseas. And it was just wonderful. And I thought that everything was just going very peachy in my life. And then I found out I was pregnant. And honestly, this was one of the worst days of my life to that point. It wasn't the plan. I didn't want children. My husband and I had pretty much decided that we were very happy being childless and we could do other things with our life and spend our time differently. I didn't really like children. I never had a sense of maternalism or cluckiness or a desire to be around children. I didn't think my personality suited parenthood. I'm very unstructured. I don't like systems. I'm kind of terrified of normal life. And so parenthood was actually really scary for me because it felt like impending doom rather than something joyful. And it was really hard to share that opinion. So I sort of kept it to myself a little bit, but it wasn't until the 20-week scan that I started to feel a little bit more okay about this situation. And I was a young mum. Like, I was only 24 years old, quite naive. I didn't have any experience with anything really medical up until that point. And I thought that the 20-week scan was simply to determine the sex of the baby, because that's all anyone ever talked about or seemed to care about. And these days, especially with social media, there's big ceremonies around it and kind of huge productions and, you know, sex reveal parties, and it's all just, it's a whole thing. It's a big deal. And yeah, so I found out on this day that this little baby was going to be a girl. So I started to kind of lean into that idea. And the sonographer also picked up on this tiny, tiny little bean of a kidney. One of her kidneys wasn't draining properly. And so this sonographer very calmly and kindly shared that, you know, we've got you. She's going to be okay. We'll just keep an eye on this. She might need some surgery after she's born just to help fix that little kidney and help it drain properly. But we'll just manage this and we'll make sure that you have some more scans and things, but we've got you. And I felt really safe and seen and secure in the knowledge that all was going to be okay. And so I kind of went through the rest of my pregnancy getting a little bit more excited about meeting this new little girl baby, not so much feeling the sense of impending doom as I might have been earlier. And then on the 30th of March 2008, Evie Amor Callander was born by cesarean birth in the Dunedin Hospital in New Zealand. And I just remember seeing her for the first time, and just all of my fears just melted away, and I just fell completely in love with this new little being in the world. She was just so full of potential and beauty and just exquisite, delicious newbornness. She was a lot smaller than anyone was expecting. She was born at 41 weeks, but she was only 2.1 kilos, and she was quite long and skinny, and she couldn't latch when we tried to feed her. So we fed her by syringe, and a nurse was with me as we did this. And so we fed her, and she just kind of choked and sort of stopped breathing, and then the nurse just grabbed her and ran out the door with her. Because where I was recovering from my cesarean birth, Evie was rushed up to a whole floor above me where the NICU ward was. So we were very separate for a whole night. And I remember just feeling this sense of, I don't know what's happening. I'm so confused. I'm in pain. I was on a morphine drip that night that had a kink in it. So I was pushing this pain relief button and nothing was happening. And so I felt like I was frustrating the nurse on duty that night. And I think she might have thought I was a drug seeker because I kept pushing this button. And so I felt really like I was being naughty, but I felt just so desperately alone and terrified in this new environment, and a lot of pain, not knowing what was going on. And the next day, our pediatrician and our midwife came to see us, and they said, look, we've done some tests overnight on Evie, and we're really concerned about her. We think that she has a chromosomal condition, which is very rare, and that's incompatible with life. And I remember hearing this phrase, incompatible with life, and I said, like, that sounds really serious. Like, is she okay? Like, is she alive? Like, incompatible with life is not good. You know, I just remember feeling this weight of words, incompatible. And then they said, look, if she does survive, which is highly unlikely, she will have severe mental retardation. She has congenital defects and skeletal abnormalities. And I remember again feeling these words, you know, retard and defects and abnormal. And I was thinking, is this the same little baby that I just met yesterday that was so beautiful and full of potential and joy? And it just didn't sound like they were describing even a person or a human being anymore. And then they said, look, we think she has Edwards syndrome or trisomy 18. I'd never heard the word trisomy before. I didn't even know how you'd spell it. The pediatrician talking to us was English, so he had a bit of an accent, and so I didn't know if it was a regular word that I was misinterpreting, or I didn't know what was going on. By this stage, I was well and truly completely confused and traumatized. And as you can see in these photographs, this is a few months after Evie was born. Life was pretty challenging with her, and we had many occasions where her life literally was hanging in the balance. But it was so fascinating because every time we went through one of these episodes with Evie, she just seemed to emerge just a little bit stronger every time and revealed more of her character to us. And she drew out a mother in me I never knew existed, a person who was more capable and strong than I could have imagined. And I loved being Evie's mum. And then she just kind of started to flourish. And in these photographs, she's around 2 years old. And she'd had about a year where she hadn't been in hospital. She just was well for a long time, and that's when her development kind of just exponentially grew, and she just loved life, and I loved being with her. And this is when I started to notice that she experienced the world a little bit differently to other people. So every time we went to visit my family, who lived a couple of hours away from us, we had to drive on a piece of road where we went underneath a whole lot of electrical pylons, like big electrical pylons. And every time we came up to these pylons, she'd just start crying, kind of out of nowhere. And then we'd pass under the pylons and she'd stop crying. And it happened at nighttime, and sometimes it would wake her up. And I was thinking, what is it about this particular piece of road that Evie doesn't like? It's so strange. She's not really a baby that cries much. And then I noticed it happened every time, like I took her to the supermarket and would be fine, and then we'd go through the electric sliding doors and she'd start crying, and I'd have to rush around the supermarket. And then as soon as we came out of the supermarket, she'd stop crying. It was like a switch went off. It was so strange. And then I thought, well, the only thing I can think of to describe this is that she has an electromagnetic sensitivity that's just completely unique to her. Maybe she can feel the vibrations or something and she doesn't like it. Maybe she's like a baby Magneto of X-Men or something, maybe she's got superpowers. And so I kind of used this as a lighthearted way to describe that particular phenomenon of Evie. But when I thought about her character and all the things she was teaching me and everyone around her, I realized that there was just so much about Evie that was really unique. And so I described all of these things as her superpowers. Like, she couldn't say a single word, but she could communicate everything she wanted and needed to me just through her voice and a sound that she would make. Like, the only thing she could say was ooh. And I knew if it was I'm happy ooh, or I'm a bit frustrated ooh, or I'm hungry ooh. Like, I knew what she meant with just this one sound. Like, we could communicate without words, without language. She loved being on a beanbag, and she loved being in water. And like, she's 2.5 and she's never had a tantrum in her life. These are all things that are really unique and pretty special about Evie. She had the most delightful little giggle, and she just drew people towards her. They couldn't help but be fascinated by her and be drawn in by her, just her pureness and her joy and her, I guess, her cheekiness. And so this language was really empowering for me, especially because at this point in her life, she was starting to be seen as being a little bit more different. And so when I took her into town, or we met strangers as we would, what was happening was the first thing that they'd ask me about Evie was, what's wrong with your child? What's wrong with her? And initially, before I had this new language of superpowers, I'd kind of take a deep breath and I'd brace myself and I'd say, well, she has partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6, and she has multiple ventricular septal defects, and she can't walk and she can't talk, and she blah, 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 blah. All of the diagnosis words in the diagnosis language. And that poor stranger just kind of glazed over and was waiting for my spiel to finish, I think. And I just hated describing Evie like this. And as I watched this stranger walk away, I could just feel this chasm of fear and indifference open up between us. Like, I hadn't been able to say anything about my child in the way that I wanted to share about my child. That was until I had this new language of superpowers. And so the next time someone asked me, what's wrong with your child? I just simply replied, nothing. Nothing is wrong with her. Actually, she has superpowers. And they kind of looked at me a bit strange, and they said, well, what do you mean? And then I got to reframe that whole conversation to share all of the things that I loved about Evie, all of the things that she could do, her unique abilities, all the things that she loved to do, what we loved to do together, how much I loved being her mum, and how every day we lived in such freedom, and just what a joy it was to be around her. And as I was sharing these things with these strangers, they'd look at her and they'd say, isn't she so beautiful? Look at those sparkly eyes and those delicate little fingers. And I'd say, yeah, she really is amazing. And because in that conversation I had described a human being, that stranger saw a human being rather than a collection of failing body parts and something to be afraid of. And so there was no chasm of fear or indifference. We'd built a bridge over that chasm. with just this compassionate, human-centered focus on humanity. We called it love and acceptance. But despite this newfound empowerment with my superpower language, I was constantly forced back into a space of feeling powerless and hopeless every time I had to fill in some kind of assessment form or needs assessment form or anything with tick box answers. And on this one particular occasion, I had to fill out a 2-page document. Our speech and language therapist had brought it around. It was a needs assessment form of some kind. And I couldn't tick a single question on that document. And I just, honestly, this form, it just broke me. It broke me this day. You know, here was my beautiful 2.5-year-old child, and I couldn't tick a single thing that they were asking of me. And I hated it. And I said to the healthcare professionals, look, I hate this document. It's so dumb. Like, all of these questions are so dumb. Like, Evie doesn't want to do any of these things anyway. Like, she does all the other cool stuff. Like, why does she want to do these things? Like, why does it matter if she's not doing these things? Like, I hated it. And I just had the sense that if I handed in this document empty with no answers, the person at the other end reviewing this document would think, well, did this mother forget to fill it out? You know, she hasn't ticked anything, or here's a child that can't do anything. Oh my goodness, here's a blob on her hands. You know, how much is this going to cost the system? And I hated that thought. I hated that feeling that somebody would place a value judgment on Evie based on the answers or lack of from this document. And so I said to my healthcare professional, I said, look, I'm not going to hand in this document as it is, and the only way I will hand it in is if I can make up my own document as well. Again, they looked at me a bit funny and they said, okay, we don't really know what you mean, but sure, go ahead. And so I sat down at my computer and I opened a Word document, and I used a very boring font. It was just Times New Roman, I think. And I titled this document Evie's Awesomeness. And I created a document of 8 questions that I could already answer yes to about my child. Now, this has gone through a few design iterations and updates, so it's looking quite snazzy, as you can see now. But these are the questions that I was able to answer yes to already. And it was so beautiful because every time I wrote yes to one of my questions, I just got so excited because I could see that Evie was growing and developing, and she was changing, and she was just becoming more herself as she grew. And while none of these things were officially measured on any official document, this became my measuring stick. I was measuring Evie only against herself. And against that measuring stick, she was doing brilliantly. And that's the thing with measuring sticks, and especially in the rare disease space. We measure people against normal, and we're excluding so many people. And we measure these little babies right from the very first moment they're conceived. And it's all against normal. And then that often can determine their value and their worthiness to even be born on some occasions. But as you can see from my questions, that, you know, they're quite random. They might never ever make it onto an official document, but you can sense Evie's character, can't you? I'll just read out a few. There's that first one there. Can your child play Sleeping Tiger and other great games? Yes. And this is a game that Evie and I made up together. Or the next question, does your child laugh when objects fall near her face? Yes. I don't know why she did, but she loved the sound of little things falling near her face. Or that last one, can your child do assisted pull-ups holding her head up? Yes. Evie does this very well using her dad to help her, and her record is 13 in a row. What a superstar. Go Evie. And so you can see that this document brought a lot of joy and empowerment. And like I said, it was my measuring stick that I used only against herself. And it changed everything for me and how I felt about the healthcare system and how I felt about measuring Evie against normal, and it just gave me permission, I guess, to throw out the official rule books of life. And I think that more people would be happy if we did that. But more officially, I'm so delighted that I've been able to share this particular story with many healthcare professionals all over the world, and to see the impact and how other people are taking this idea and using it in their own way. And so that slide on the left, there's a speech and language therapist in New Zealand who's creating awesomeness reports, which is basically a paragraph or two at the end of an official clinical report that speaks to the humanity of the child that she's working with. And these reports are triggered by the speech and language therapist asking just a few simple questions like, have you noticed anything different since last time we were here that your child now enjoys? Or what's brought you joy this week about your child? Or what's something that your child loves to do? Or is there anything that you and your child love to do together? And those beautiful things, those very human things, are also part of the clinical document. And this particular speech and language therapist has said, look, since making these awesomeness reports, she's enjoying her job more because she feels like she's able to connect with those families and children in a way that she never has been before, and that those families trust her more, that the relationship is more positive, it's more effective, that the families are actually now able to see development in other areas of their child, not just limited to speech and language, because those families now feel like they've been given permission to celebrate the abilities of their child. And it's fascinating, just that simple shift can have such a powerful difference for people. And then this slide on the right, this was shared on Instagram a number of years ago by a mother who was just absolutely overjoyed to read this first paragraph on quite a serious clinical document, and just how that shifted her emotional state. And I'll just read it out. So this is the first paragraph that this mother receives. Once again, I am just thrilled to see how well your son is growing and developing. Yes, he does have significant dyskinetic cerebral palsy, but this is being well managed, and his great strengths of interpersonal interaction and awareness continue to shine through. So when a parent is in a positive emotional state, you can imagine how much better prepared she is to read whatever comes next in that document. And in the rare disease space, like, parents have so many pieces of paper, either digital or physical, with so many big words, big scary words, medical language, diagnosis words that often don't speak to the humanity of their child. And it can cause trauma and grief and alienation and frustration and anger. And so language is really powerful in this space. Sadly, though, Evie's life wasn't a long one, but for 2.5 years, Evie was completely compatible with life every single day of those 2.5 years. Her life just wasn't as long as we might have hoped, but in her short, remarkable little life, she inspired a dream, and it's become her legacy, as have I, essentially. And so the dream was to travel around New Zealand, to meet and photograph other children with rare diseases, all kinds of different conditions, and sort of celebrate their superpowers, their abilities, their uniqueness, and to capture them beautifully photographically, and to create like a gorgeous coffee table art book. And so a few years after Evie died, I kind of gathered myself together and went about my intrepid journey all around New Zealand, and it was one of the happiest times of my life, was meeting these children and creating the Superpower Baby Project book. And I interviewed and met 75 families and 75 children, and it was just so much fun. And then more recently, here in Perth, Western Australia, with my husband, we conducted the follow-up initiative Superpower Kids, which features 33 West Australian children and young adults, again celebrating abilities, superpowers, uniqueness, and humanity of these children. And at this point, I'd love to encourage you to get cozy. I'd love to show you a slideshow of the photographs that feature in both of these books. Sadly, I won't be able to use my music. Teams won't allow that. So you just might have to imagine your favorite piece of music playing along. But here we go. We will see. What do you see in those photographs? Like, this is something I ask audiences all over the world, and one of the first things they yell back at me is joy. And I wonder if that popped into your head too. Well, they say love, happiness, vibrancy, potential, cheekiness, hope, fun, and they're all of those things were absolutely present in these children. And these words were commonly described by the families as well. And they used words like, look, we're learning unconditional love and perseverance and kindness and tenacity. And it's really hard, but we love our children and they're amazing and they're showing us what really matters in the world. And I was just struck by how these words and these concepts are so big and they're so full of humanity, and they're in such stark contrast to the words that we've been given to describe rare diseases and difference, especially by the medical world. We've been given words like abnormal, defective, mutated, dysmorphic, disabled, retarded, incompatible. And I feel like these words have a very different energy about them. You know, they take potential and even ability away from a person. This document was given to me by my doctors after Evie was born as a way to help me navigate the very scary future, the million questions that I had that couldn't be answered. And I just remember looking at this document and just feeling instantly just heartbroken for this little child and their parents. You know, this little child has been photographed as a specimen, essentially. And it was just awful. And I mean, I didn't understand 80% of the words in this document. And the ones I did really were quite hurtful, you know. They described the features of my child that I found so much beauty in and saw so much delight in. And I don't have time to go into it all here, but what I usually do in a conference setting or a workshop is I read out the words that I understood, and it basically describes in detail the features of this syndrome. You know, words like a long fleshy nose and a beaked nose, and eyes being deep-seated and small and triangular mouth. And I get the audience to imagine drawing what they hear me say, essentially, from these words that I did understand. And a lot of the drawings, imaginary or real, end up being very strange looking indeed, you know, despite, you know, artistic ability. It's very strange looking creatures, kind of like elephant, pterodactyl, dinosaur creatures, essentially. None have ever come close to drawing a human girl child, and none as cute as this one. And it's interesting, you know, because I just remember feeling that, again, that weight of pain when I read the document, and I could understand only a few of them, but the ones I did diminished the beauty and potential in my beautiful child. And Evie's condition was so rare, it didn't have a name. You know, they called it partial trisomy 9 and partial monosomy 6. So a deletion and a duplication on 2 of her chromosomes. But she had 13 very definitive medical elements that made up this particular syndrome, essentially. And on every single piece of paper that I received, there was this list of 13 things. And one of the words that kept coming up was arachnodactyly. And one day I just was like, what the heck is that? Like, I can't handle this word, arachnodactyly. What does that mean? And so I Googled it, and it came up as spider hands. That's what it translates to in Latin. I was like, well, that makes sense, because Evie did have very long fingers and toes. And like, I'm terrified of spiders. Like, I didn't like this at all. Arachnodactyly. I was thinking, no. I used to call them her fairy fingers, and I thought, why couldn't they find the Latin for fairy fingers? That's way better description than Latin, you know, spider hands. And so again, it's just the impact of language, and you know, it really does shape our landscape, and we make it mean things, and we make it we build a world of understanding when we have this language. Now I'm just checking in, Sian, is everyone okay out there? I can't see anybody because I'm sharing my
Yeah, we're going beautifully, Rachel. You're doing great. Thank you.
Excellent. I just needed to check in. I've become fascinated by language, and especially the words of healthcare, especially over the last decade or so. So Evie completely hijacked my wedding and portrait photography business after I made Superpower Baby Project. I ended up being invited to do a TED Talk, and that was my very ever first speaking engagement. Was on a stage in front of 2,500 people in Auckland. So it was pretty terrifying, but also really such a huge honor. And from there, I was asked to speak at conferences and help healthcare professionals to really understand the impact of their language. And so over the last decade, I've been really honing in on this and looking into my own research. And I've created this little tool as part of that, because it's hard for everybody. It's really hard for everybody. I've been speaking to healthcare professionals all over the world, and they're like, we don't go to work to do a bad job and to intentionally hurt people. And I think, of course they don't, you know, it's just is the language can often get in the way. And so hopefully this can be useful. And this will all be in your resource pack as well, with more examples, because I don't have time to go into all of the examples, and you'll have your own as well that you'll be familiar with. So this is just a quick overview. So basically we have the positive and negative and jargon and formative axes. And where those axes meet, we end up with these 4 quadrants. And so we'll start with that first top left one, the positive jargon quadrant, which ends up as patronizing language. And again, no one intends to be patronizing, I don't think, on purpose. And it comes from a very well-meaning space, this kind of language, but it often relies on cliche and can end up almost being toxically positive and fluffy. Because in the fear of saying the wrong thing, that's when you end up relying on those kind of cliches and it doesn't actually land. So I remember when Evie was born, a lot of people would say, special kids are only given to special parents, or God only gives you what you can handle. And while this might sound like it's a nice thing to say, often parents aren't feeling special. They love their child, but they're feeling overwhelmed and exhausted and traumatized and just absolutely at their wits' end. They're feeling isolated, they're feeling confused. And then when they're labeled special, it sort of reduces that very large human experience into something positive, where they feel like they actually then can't ask for help and support because they're special. Or if families and parents are put on a pedestal, or I don't know how you do it, you're so strong, just stay strong. And I think, again, that minimizes the very big range of emotions and experiences that is happening for a parent of a child with a rare disease, or especially at diagnosis point. Or even after Evie died, I remember people saying to me, she's in a better place now. And I was thinking, that's so hurtful, because now you're saying that the best place for her is not right with me in my arms, which is where I absolutely want her to be. And so this language can cause hurt and pain and upset. And while it's not intentional, it can do a lot of damage. And then we have this jargon negative quadrant. And I guess the output is confusing. This could also be named clinical language. Or medicine language, because unless you speak medicine language, basically all of the 50,000 or so unique words that belong in the medicine language just naturally fall into this quadrant where they're confusing and clinical. The thing with this language is that when you're confused, you can't make any decisions, and confusion is one of the most damaging parts or elements in communication, and it can cause so much damage between healthcare professionals and families, and even with healthcare professionals and each other. Like I said, you cannot make decisions when you're confused. You don't even know what questions you need to ask when you're confused. It wastes so much time as well. As an example of this, I remember we had a pediatrician. He was a senior pediatrician. He was a big man. I remember thinking he's a big person, like not a big physical man, but he was a big person in the hospital. And I remember thinking, Rachel, your one job is to understand everything he says. Do not waste his time. He's very important. And so we were still living in the hospital. Evie had more tests. They were still trying to figure out what was going on with her. My husband and I had been tested genetically as well, and he was tasked with giving us the results of that genetic test. And it turns out I'm a carrier for the condition that Evie has. So he was explaining that I have a balanced translocation and Evie has an unbalanced translocation. And, I've learned how to use these words now, but in the moment I was just like, what? I don't know what you mean. And so he started to explain this by using a metaphor, which is quite a good strategy. He said, Rachel, it's like this, your body's like a library with all of the books in the library. Some of your books have got chapters missing and they're in other books. So, for example, you've got like chapters from Game of Thrones over there in Pride and Prejudice, which would make the craziest book in the history of the world as it stands. But all of the words are there. Your brain can unscramble it. They're in the wrong place, but there's no information missing. It's just a little bit muddled up. Okay. Evie has got chapters duplicated and chunks missing and pieces over there that shouldn't be there and additional bits there, and her library isn't complete, and so that's how she is. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm barely hanging on. I've got you. I think I understand. And then, I've learned this recently, that when you're confused or you're in a state of high trauma or pressure or stress, a person can lose up to 40 IQ points in that moment. Like, your amygdala just starts to shut down to protect itself. Like, your body goes into fight or flight or freeze mode, as you will know, to protect itself from the overwhelming information that's being bombarded at it. And so I could feel my brain starting to turn to mush. And I can't remember what he was saying, and I could just hear his words, and they sounded like more sounds, until he said two words that I did understand, and I was kind of snapped back to reality. And he'd said short arms, and I was like, oh, I know what those words mean. I know short arms. And then I was thinking, well, that's weird, because Evie's arms are quite perfectly longish looking to me. Like, what's he going on about these arms? Anyway, and so he kept going, and then I could feel my brain turning to mush again, and all I was thinking about was, the length of Evie's arms and library books, and I was like, I'm so confused. And my one job was to understand, and now I'm wasting his time because I have no idea where he's going. And I was aware that he was wrapping up the spiel, and he's looking at his watch, and he's walking out the door, and he says, do you have any questions? And I bravely piped up, knowing that he was a big man and I wasn't to waste his time, and I said, yes, I have a question. And I said, look, what are we going to do about Evie's short arms? Because that's all I understood from the conversation. And he looked at me with this look like, what on earth are you talking about, woman? And he just said, nothing. Her arms are fine, and then just walked out the door. And in that moment, I just felt like such an idiot. I just felt so stupid, and I felt like, oh my gosh, I've wasted my chance to ask a question. And just this feeling of confusion and being stupid and being sleep deprived and absolutely exhausted and still just so uncertain about anything, all of these very big feelings churned into one big ball of anger. And I just remember thinking, I hate that doctor. He makes me feel stupid. And you're probably working with some families who have had similar experiences, and they might not even be able to speak what it is that's happened, but they feel angry and they're defensive and they're utterly traumatized and afraid. And this is exactly what happened to me. So every time he came to see us to tell us anything new, I was just like a brick wall. That was my way of protecting myself from feeling these unbearable feelings of anger and stupidity and all of the other stuff. And so he would come in and he would explain things to us, and I'd nod and smile and nod and smile, and he would say, do you understand? And I'd say, yes, yes, yes. What a waste of time. That is such a waste of time, because he had so much knowledge that could have been potentially so useful to us as parents of this child with this very rare condition. But none of it made any sense. And so it wasn't translated. And so him explaining it to us was just a waste of time. And when time is one of the most precious commodities in the whole health system, confusion is such a waste of it. So I think it's really important. And I could talk about this stuff all day. And again, in the resource pack, there's multiple examples of this kind of language. Same with acronyms and all of the rest, because most people speak regular person language, and it's really hard for healthcare professionals when they are trained to speak medical person language or medicine language to then have to translate it. So it's not an easy task, and I understand, but it's really important to be aware of the impact of this kind of communication. And then we have this negative informative quadrant, and this is where we find destructive language, and I've mentioned it a few times today. Words like incompatible with life, retarded, spastic, geriatric, dysmorphic, mutated. Especially in the rare disease space, you get a lot of that kind of word, mutation, defects, and even anomalies, things like that. They don't seem to be as destructive in talking with families and parents. But even when parents are expecting a baby and there's a miscarriage, all of a sudden that dream of a baby, that hope, is turned into a product of conception or debris that needs to be cleared. And I remember I had beautiful friends who recently had a miscarriage, and she said, look, I was doing fine until the moment the nurse said product of conception, and she wouldn't acknowledge that this was a life, that it was the potential of a child. And I think that in those moments, that's when our humanity really, really needs to show up, and we can destroy so much potential and ability. And I think that no matter the length of a life, they have impact. And I think we as a culture, we value the length of a life over the impact of a life. And I think it's a misguided, again, way of measuring. The length doesn't determine the impact. I think all lives have impact, even if it's for a breath, for a moment. And even if a child is born without air in their lungs, there is still a need for deep respect and support and acknowledgement of the impact that that life has had, even for a short moment. But look, there is hope. Look at this shiny yellow empowering quadrant here, the empowering communication. And again, I've got time just for one or two examples, and I'm so happy to have many examples of these to share with you. But I think the most significant came from our clinical geneticist. So we saw him just a few days after this encounter with the senior pediatrician. And they could not have been more different from each other, these two encounters. I remember this man, this clinical geneticist, he was just so warm, big smile, introduced himself, sat us down, and the first thing he did, it wasn't a big spiel about big words or anything. He asked a question. And the way he opened that conversation up to us was, what do you know about chromosomes? And I looked at him and I said, look, I couldn't even draw you one. And he said, all right, then, let's start there. And so he started drawing some squiggly little lines. And I remember within 20 seconds, I'm like, oh my gosh, the short arm, I get it now. Who knew chromosomes had arms? I didn't know. I didn't know anything about chromosomes until this man spent some time explaining it to me. And I was like, this is amazing. Who knew? Well, I did now because he told me. So I just remember feeling so empowered and just honored that this big person would share his knowledge with me in a way that I then got to grow and learn from. And so I didn't feel stupid. I felt like I left that office knowing more than when I went in. And I think that's kind of the point when you have encounters with people like that. Or if they don't know the answers, that they can say, we don't know, but we'll figure it out together, which is pretty much what this beautiful man said. He said, look, Evie is so rare. We're going to learn so much from her and so much from you as your parents. We're going to be partners in this, and I'll share what I know and you can share what you learn and discover, and together we will be Evie's team. And I just thought that was such a brilliant way of being so honest with the information that he had and that we could all grow and learn from. And in interviewing the families, they all shared similar sentiments with me. They're just looking for something real, not positive, toxic, positive, fluffy stuff, but they just need something to hang on to, just someone to see their child as a real human being, worthy of care and worthy of value. And this, from a parent, I always think of those words and phrases as the scars that they've left behind. And often these scars, they're so unseen, but they can do so much damage. And like I said before, no one goes to work to intentionally harm or cause harm. And I think, that beautiful phrase, first do no harm, it's often in the words we speak that can do the most harm. And so it's really important to be aware of language, aware of the words that we're using, and not to be afraid of them. And I hope that as I'm talking, you're not thinking, oh gosh, I think I've used patronizing language, and I think I've used confusing language, and oh my gosh, I've done a terrible job, and what if I've hurt patients or families? I really hope that you can bring so much love and compassion to yourself and take from this an opportunity to grow and learn, because it's okay. It's okay. Bring awareness and compassion to yourself as well. I hope that makes sense. And again, this kind of empowering communication, I'm just checking my time. We've got a few more minutes and I'll wrap up soon. This empowering communication, it actually asks more questions. It does less talking. It really does seek to align with another person. And especially when one person often has more information than another, like there's a imbalance, I guess. And so the person with the more information, I guess, needs to be really conscious of how the other person might receive this, or how best to go about sharing this kind of information. And so when I say, this kind of communication asks more questions, there's so many questions you could ask. And so again, I've divided questions into these 4 different categories. And again, this is a whole workshop, so I'm sort of skimming over it. These 4 categories: what are you proud of? What do you hope for? What are you afraid of? And what do you need? Now, these 4 questions as they stand are too big. They're not actually safe, and they're not very useful. So if I was to ask any one of you, what do you need? You might say, well, what do you have? I'll take it all. It's not very useful. And what are you afraid of can be extremely triggering. So in workshop sessions, I've had healthcare professionals come up with as many different ways of asking these 4 questions, because it really does speak to the dignity, capability, vulnerability, and humanity of a person when you can kind of touch on some of these things. And again, this will be in your resource pack, but there's some really beautiful questions that when you're seeking to align with a family, especially if they're a little bit harder to work with and there might be some walls up, some of these questions can be really a nice way of gently inviting conversation. And what do you hope for? Again, what would quality of life look like for you? So you can get some really powerful answers. I think the more nuanced your question, the more clear you can direct your care and expertise. What are you afraid of? Is there anything you're avoiding? How do you respond to stress? Is there a thought that wakes you up at night? Some of these questions can be really powerful. And then look at this. What do you need? So many different ways of asking this question. One of my favorite ones is, what makes your day harder than it needs to be? Or is there anything you're going to go home and Google later? And what is that? And I think that's really powerful as well. In our workshops, we also come up with really powerful opening and closing questions. These 4 categories are more kind of the meaty bits in the middle. So in your resource pack, there's those examples as well. So I love this quote by Stan Grant. It was recently as part of an ABC interview that he was part of. It was right around the time where Sam Kerr, the captain of the Matildas, was being interrogated for being called a racist. So it was around racism, and Stan Grant said this beautiful thing in his interview: we do not have the language or the love to deal with the fragility of the human existence. I just think that is so well put. And in the health system, and I think in many systems and many human systems, we're so good at dehumanizing the systems, and it's exactly what we need to make it safe and to bring that love into the space. And nurses, honestly, nurses are the ones that are the love in so many cases. And they bring so much love and so much practical compassion to the space. And again, like I said, you bear the brunt of having to hold that space often alone, and it's not always supported. And again, from Stan Grant, I feel diminished because I am turned into a caricature that doesn't see the fullness of my humanity. And I think this happens a lot in rare disease space and disability spaces. You feel diminished and you're turned into those diagnosis words. And the thing is, you can't be diagnosed with your identity. A diagnosis will shape how you experience your life, but it is not who you are as a person. And just one last final idea to share with you. There's been a school of thought around for a number of years, training programs and education for healthcare professionals. You might be familiar with models such as Breaking Bad News. And even this I find quite problematic, because there's an assumption that any news that deviates from normal is bad. So it's a very binary way of thinking. It's very black and white. It's very judgmental. So there's a good and a bad and a right and a wrong, and whatever news is about to be delivered, that is very bad. And yes, I concur that the information can change people's lives, and it can be excruciatingly hard what is learned, but people will make meaning out of what is said. So when a child is being diagnosed and it's bad news, then often the parents will form an opinion about their child as being bad or being wrong, because language does shape our landscape. And so now that's kind of not as popular as a way to describe this education as it once was. And so there's now new schools of thought coming in, and I've heard, delivering difficult news or difficult information. And there's an amazing pediatric nurse in the UK who is teaching education around having tender conversations, especially in the palliative care space. And it's got me thinking about all of this, and I think sometimes if you set yourself up for a difficult conversation, you're most likely going to have a difficult conversation because you're already feeling that energy of difficulty. But maybe what we need is to have an awareness of what kind of conversation is required in this space. There's some really hard stuff that we have to talk about. What is the energy and spirit that we need to invite into this conversation? Does it need to be gentle? Does it need to be honest? What would it look like if I was to have a compassionate conversation about something really hard? So you can sort of get the idea of, if you can kind of name the conversation before you have it, you're more likely to be able to have that kind of conversation. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, all will be unpacked a little bit more in the resource pack. But yeah, hopefully it's helpful. This is me. If you'd like to reach out and connect at any time, I'd love to hear from you. So I will stop sharing and we'll check in with you and see how you all are. Hi, everyone.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rachel. I just think I can speak on behalf of everyone here present today and those that are viewing online that your presentation sparks so much thought and will be the fuel of a lot of reflection of our own practices, and hopefully will be the seed of empowerment for change within our practices and to spread that awareness of the superpowers versus the diagnosis language, which I think you've articulated beautifully. So I would like to thank you for your time and your expertise and for sharing your wonderful story with us. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us today for your time. And for those online who aren't a part of the Global Nursing Network, please join up so you can have access to these webinars and to all of the resources that Rachel has mentioned throughout her session. You can do the QR code or join up on our website, and we have these webinars bi-monthly. So there is lots to come in the future. So I will let you all get back to your days. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.